Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're taking your sources, digging in, and pulling out the key insights for you.
And today we've got that LatinEagles.pdf you sent over. We're going to unpack the story of the almighty Latin Eagles nation.
Right. We'll cover their origins in Chicago, their symbols, the conflicts, how they changed, all that.
Yeah, the mission here is simple. Give you a clear, concise picture of this group and its history drawn straight from this document. No overload, just the core story.
Okay, let's jump in. The source says they started mid-60s, Halstead and Addison area on the north side.
That's it, specifically 1964. But it wasn't initially a gang in the way we might think now.
How so? What was the initial setup?
Well, according to this document, it started as a Puerto Rican club, the main reason. Self-defense.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they were dealing with white greaser gangs bullying them. So they banded together. That protection angle is, really how it began.
So how does it go from a community club to being described later as a serious street gang in the 70s? What were those steps?
The document points to some key turf disputes early on. Seems like that was a big driver.
Like what?
Well, first, there was a conflict over the playground at Lemoyne Elementary School. Waveland and Halstead fighting a greaser gang for that spot.
Okay, so already fighting for space.
Exactly. Then they had what the source calls a rumble with another group, the aristocrats.
The rumble.
Yeah, sounds old school, right? But it was serious. They fought to take over the area around Grayson, Wilton.
Oh, did they?
They did.
Yeah.
They apparently still call that area the motherland. So these weren't just small things. They were about controlling territory.
Right, establishing themselves.
Yeah.
And it didn't stop there, did it? The high school.
No, definitely not. Things got more intense at Lakeview High School. It was a three-way thing. The Latin Eagles, the Latin Kings, and the Harrison Gents, all vying for control.
Sounds like a powder keg.
It really is, and that led to the Eagles taking control of the school territory. But the violence didn't end there.
There was payback.
There was. In 1968, the Gents retaliated. They caught a Latin Eagle named Hipólito Vega.
Right.
And beat him to death. The source says they used a golf club. Really brutal.
God, that's grim. And the document says Vega became a gang martyr.
Yeah. Well, you see this happen. These violent events, these losses, they create this powerful story within the group. Loyalty, remembrance, maybe revenge. It binds people together.
And 1968 seems like a big year for them, not just because of that. There was this whole other shift happening, too.
Absolutely. A really interesting turn. The source connects it to the wider context that the Black Panthers, the civil rights movement gaining steam,
Okay.
and two Latin Eagles known as Pops and Jose Cha-Cha Jimenez, described as homeboys, they're really influenced by all this. Jimenez had just gotten out of prison.
So what did they do?
They decided to branch off, took a faction of the Eagles with them, and started something new. The Young Lords organization.
The Young Lords. Right, I've heard of them, but they came from the Latin Eagles.
According to this document, yes, a direct offshoot. And their goal wasn't turf anymore, it was political.
Political how?
They wanted to fight, and I'm quoting here, a corrupt system, racism, and segregation. They were taking their street experiences and aiming them at bigger societal issues.
That's actually fascinating. Going from neighborhood defense to political activism.
It really is. It makes you wonder what allowed them to make that leap, to channel that energy into systemic change when other groups didn't necessarily go that route.
And the Young Lords became pretty significant, didn't they? Not just a local Chicago thing.
Oh, definitely. The source mentions they got involved in local politics, built up influence, and then expanded. Big time.
Where to?
New York City, for one.
Yeah.
And then chapters started popping up across the country. It shows how local action, local grievances can sometimes spark something much bigger.
But the main Latin Eagles group, they didn't all go down that political path.
No, it seems like that was a specific faction. The document suggests the core group kind of refocused back onto the north side turf after the Young Lords took off.
So back to the streets, essentially.
Pretty much. Expanding their territory again, places like Wrigleyville, Uptown, Rogers Park. They also set up near Irving Park in Ashland.
And they established a main base.
Yeah, Gill Park, over on Sheridan and Broadway. That became their stronghold, according to this. And during this time, new rivals emerged.
Who were they fighting then?
The Latin Kings and the PR Stones are mentioned as becoming their mortal enemies. So the focus shifted back to those kinds of local power struggles.
Okay, so territorial focus again. Then the document mentions a big change in the late 70s. Alliances.
Right, 1978. This was huge. They joined the Folks Alliance.
Prison Alliance.
Right.
Larry Hoover's group.
That's the one. Hoover and the Black Gangster Disciples were central to it. So the Latin Eagles aligned with them, and also groups like the Simon City Royals, Ashland Vikings, Latin Disciples.
So they became part of this massive structure.
Exactly. And on the street, they were also part of something called the ULO, the United Latino Organization. That included groups like the Spanish Cobras and the Imperial Gangsters, who were also folks.
Interesting. Cobras and Imperial Gangsters.
Hmm?
We'll come back to them.
Yeah, those alliances shifted later, but joining folks was a major step. It plugged them into that larger Chicago gang network, really changed their position.
You have to wonder what drove that decision, the benefits versus maybe the loss of some independence.
That's a good question. The document doesn't really dive into the why, just the what. And it also notes they kept expanding in the 80s.
Where to next?
The West Side. They set up shop around Costner and Armitage, Kenneth and Armitage, Palmer and Kenneth, an area they apparently called Dark Side.
Dark side. Okay. So more expansion probably means more conflict, right?
It seems inevitable, and the late 80s and 90s sound particularly rough based on this document. There's a specific incident, 1989, a party.
Yeah, it tells a story about a nightclub on North Avenue. Spanish Cobras, MLDs, Campbell Boys were there, and Latin Eagles.
And trouble started. A dispute between a cobra and an eagle. Someone pulled a gun.
Always escalates things.
For sure. It spilled outside, turned into a big street fight, and the outcome was tragic.
What happened?
A Latin eagle from Wrigleyville, known as Lil Rook, was killed, beaten with a wooden 2x4.
Jesus. That's horrifying.
Yeah. And the document marks that as the start of a really bad conflict between the Eagles and the Spanish Cobras. They apparently had a temporary truce after, but
But it didn't last.
seems not. Then, fast forward a bit to 95. Another war breaks out, this time with the gangster disciples, the GDs.
Why them?
Territory again. The source says the GDs were moving into Latin Eagle areas. Classic trigger for conflict.
So, fighting the GDs.
Yeah.
But they were both folks, weren't they?
Well, things were shifting. Around the mid-90s, the Eagles formed a tighter alliance called the Almighty Folks Familia. This was specifically with the Almighty Imperial Gangsters and the Simon City Royals.
Ah, so reinforcing ties with some folks groups.
Right. But by the end of the 90s, the document describes a permanent bloody war breaking out.
Against who?
Against the insane familia led by the Spanish Cobras, their old ULO partners, and the Maniac Familia, run by the Maniac Latin disciples. So former allies became major enemies. Shows how fluid those alliances really were.
It really does. So
Yeah.
through all this, club, political offshoot, gang wars, alliances shifting,
Yeah.
how did they identify themselves? What were their signs?
The document lists their colors as gray and black.
Okay, gray and black.
And symbols include an eagle head, an eagle in flight, and something called the universal fork.
Universal fork, what's that?
The source doesn't elaborate much on it, just lists it. Interestingly, it also mentions they used to use the folk nation pitchfork symbol.
The main fork symbol.
Yeah, but they stopped using it after the wars with the SGDs. That's the gangster disciples and the GDs.
So even their symbols changed based on who they were fighting.
Exactly. It shows how identity markers can shift with conflict and changing alliances. It's not always static.
Okay, so let's try and wrap our heads around this.
Mhm.
We started with a Puerto Rican club in the 60s, formed for protection.
Right. Then that unexpected turn where a faction creates the Young Lords, a major political group.
Which is pretty amazing thinking about it. But the main group becomes, well, a street gang, expanding territory, getting into major alliances like the folks.
And then deep into some really violent conflicts with groups like the Cobras and the Disciples by the late 90s. It's quite a trajectory.
The thing that really stands out, I think, is that Young Lords connection. How this group, fighting greasers, gave birth to a national political movement.
It really does make you think differently, doesn't it? About where political consciousness can come from. Not always from established channels, sometimes right from the street level, from those immediate needs and conflicts.
It kind of blurs the lines we sometimes draw between, community groups, gangs, political organizations.
Definitely. So thinking about this whole history, this transformation, what does it tell us?
That's the big question, isn't it? You see this group responding to community needs, forming an identity, but then the path diverges so drastically. Some towards politics, others deeper into conflict.
Yeah, and it makes you consider how much local context matters. The specific pressures, the opportunities, the leadership, how all that shapes whether a group's energy goes in one direction or another.
Constructive versus destructive paths, maybe. It's
Yeah.
complex.
It is. It really highlights how these groups aren't monolithic. They evolve, they splinter, they react. This history shows that dynamic interplay between identity, environment, and the choices people make.
Definitely leaves you with something to think about. how those local stories, those specific histories like the Latin Eagles, can sometimes echo or even influence much broader social and political currents.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that these histories are often way more complicated and frankly more interesting than we might assume at first glance.